Bismillah, alhamdulillah, as-salatu was-salam ala rasulillah.
So, assalamu alaikum everyone, welcome for coming for this talk, and thanks for coming, Ustaz Daniel, for coming and talking here. So I will just make a small intro, and then basically it's all about the speaker and what he speaks about, and then we'll have a discussion. So he said there's going to be 45 minutes of discussion, lecture, kind of the present topic, then Q&A and discussion. So Daniel is a native of Houston, Texas, and completed his undergraduate in Harvard and graduate studies at Tufts University in philosophy. He founded the Boston Muslim Internet Scholastic Tournament, missed here in Boston as an undergrad at Harvard. They used to come here for the MIT. It's still ongoing and really cool. And he has spoken at universities and mosques around the US, and his work has been featured in outlets such as the Washington Post, The Atlantic, CNN, Al Jazeera, Public Discourse, Mashable, and First Things. He teaches as an adjunct faculty member at Respect Graduate School. You can read his writings in muslimskeptic.com. He was also previously a director at the European Institute. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion on navigating faith and scientism and evolutionary thought.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu was-salam ala rasulillah. Thank you very much for inviting me here to MIT, the second best school in Cambridge, third best if you count Lesley University. I am excited to be here to talk to you about feminism. Evolution. Evolution is a topic, not feminism. So what I want, just to outline what I want to discuss with you, I want to take you through a straight argument on how Muslims can understand the theory of evolution, how does that play into the bigger question of Islam's relationship with science, and what Islam has to say about the world versus what science has to say about the world at large. And so before I begin on this topic, the first question that I'd like to pose to you all to start with is, who here believes that Islam and science can never, in principle, conflict? Okay, so, okay, some people, who's unsure? Okay, and who thinks that they can conflict? Okay, so everyone raise their hand for one of those choices. So this is something that I think is important to begin with, whether Islam and science can ever, in principle, conflict. I have my perspective. I'll try to convince you, and then once we determine that, we can go into a larger discussion of Islam and evolution, and if there's any conflict there, and how we can understand any conflicts that might be there. So if we are thinking about Islam and evolution, certainly in the Quran and in Hadith and in the scholarly tradition, there are claims about the world around us and about the structure of the universe, the way that the universe works, and some examples. I'll just give you a list. So the createdness of the universe. The universe was created. It has a beginning and it will have an end. The existence of angels and angels' activity in the world. The existence of jinn and their activity in the world. The existence of consciousness absent a physical body, basically the soul, ruh. The resurrection of organisms after death and their bodily decomposition. The existence of heaven and hell. Isra wal-Mi'raj, the night journey to Jerusalem and the ascension. Many different prophetic miracles, splitting of the sea, splitting of the moon, raising the dead, curing the blind, curing the lepers. These are all miracles. The extraordinarily long lives of certain individuals, such as Nuh, peace be upon him, Noah, such as the youth of the cave in Surah Al-Kahf, and Khidr as well, mentioned in Surah Al-Kahf, not by name. The throne of Allah, Arsh, and the footstool, Kursi of Allah, of God, the seven heavens, the rejection of the amana, that is mentioned in the Quran, the moral trust, the rejection of that by the heavens, earth, the mountains, the clouds even. So these entities are described as if they can reject something or accept something. And there's also hadith, prophetic narrations that speak of, for example, a tree stump that wept and cried after the Prophet, peace be upon him, did not give his Friday sermon at that stump. And also stones as well who wept or had other kinds of human characteristics of that nature. The fact that all creatures sing the praises of God, also mentioned in the Quran very clearly, the creation of Adam in paradise, the different capabilities of the Prophet Solomon, Suleiman. If we read these things very plainly in the Quran, those are quite amazing, and it doesn't seem like they're things that science today would recognize as having occurred. The existence of sihr, magic, the existence of the evil eye, again, things that science today would not recognize. The existence of life in the grave, in the barzakh. The reality of barakah, blessing and sanctity. These are all things that are not encapsulated by a materialistic or naturalistic or scientistic worldview. And so are these examples, do they pose a conflict between Islam and science? This is the question. And this accords with the philosophy of a particular biologist named Stephen Jay Gould, who argued that the distinction between religion and science is that they occupy non-overlapping magisteria. And this is the argument of Stephen Jay Gould. He said that science is concerned with what exists, how the universe works, whereas religion is purely concerned with spiritual matters, moral matters, what happens after death, and some of the bigger questions of purpose in life. And so religion and science are occupying his term is non-overlapping magisteria. They have different domains of applicability. So is this something that Muslims accept as well? Is there a very neat and tidy distinction between all of the things I mentioned in that list versus what science tells us is real and what science explains to us as how the world is and how the world works? And so this is what I want you to think about very seriously. My understanding and what I take from this is that's a very convenient kind of ontology. That's a very too convenient way to think about the way that the world works. That there are some aspects of the world that are only described in Revelation, in the Quran, angels, jinn, barakah, all of those things I described, which we usually think, or we should think as Muslims, have a reality, have an impact in the world around us, impact that we can perceive and impact that we can feel. We usually think that describes the world around us, or we should believe that. But if we have this idea that no, anything that happens around us that we can perceive and feel is only described by science, and science rejects angels, jinn, barakah, sihr, and so on and so forth, then this creates a conflict. This creates a conflict that we have to resolve. And my observation is that living in modern times, many Muslims don't viscerally feel the reality of what I just described. Because if we think about what God is telling us in Revelation as Muslims, again, there are claims about the world around us, the physical world. Things like barakah, for example, are very relevant. Things like the evil eye are supposed to be very relevant. If we follow the sunnah and we are making dua, for example, before stepping into a washroom or a bathroom and asking for protection from kinds of dark forces, these are things that science does not recognize at all. But as Muslims, if we're constantly invoking these concepts, then we should viscerally feel their reality and even perceive their reality. But unfortunately, if you adopt a kind of materialistic or purely naturalistic worldview, then what happens is that these things don't have that same effect on you. You don't have the same consciousness of them. And many Muslims, I'll ask, how often in a day do you think about angels? How often in a day do you think about jinn or baraka or all of these, what we consider unseen and what are unseen, they're part of the ghaib in certain respects, are all around us, right? Are all around us and have an impact on not only Muslims but also non-Muslims, right? So this is a problem. If a Muslim, for example, feels the reality or thinks of something like the Higgs boson, right? Or dark matter or black holes, like they feel like those things are real, right? Even they might not be theoretical physicists or cosmologists, but they still have that feeling that those things are real, but they haven't even reflected on the fact that malaika are all around us and impact our thoughts and are recording our deeds and all of these realities that are described to us very clearly and explicitly in Revelation. So this is something to reflect on. Does our ontology, so when I use the word ontology, I mean our understanding of what exists in the world. That's what ontology means. So the Muslim ontology, the Islamic ontology, includes angels and jinn and baraka, heaven, hell, the akhirah, the barzakh, and all of these things I listed for you. Do we feel that? Do we take that seriously at face value and act accordingly? So this is like a spiritual impact of scientism, is that when we adopt and internalize a naturalistic perspective on the world, then that will affect us spiritually. That's all I'm saying here. And we should understand that it's often said that the Quran is not a science textbook. The Quran is not a science textbook. That's true. It's not a scientific textbook. It's not a scientific text. But again, it does describe things as they really are. It does describe reality as it is, and many different aspects of reality. So we don't reduce our revelation to just purely spiritual, purely moral teaching that doesn't have any bearing on what exists. And so I would reject the non-overlapping magisteria that Stephen Jay Gould proposes. I think that, true, the Quran is not a book of science, but the Quran is describing reality, and science also describes reality. So what happens when there is conflict? What happens when there's logical conflict that is unavoidable? Okay, there's different ways to solve or reconcile conflict. The most predominant way that Christian theologians over the years have reconciled the conflicts between the Bible and science is to say that, in these areas the Bible is metaphorical or allegorical, and we can interpret the Bible allegorically in order to reconcile the Bible with modern scientific findings. I think this is problematic from a purely intellectual perspective, and I'll talk about the reasons for this in a second. But let's go back to this idea of a logical conflict. So prior to the 20th century, the predominant belief among scientists and the scientific consensus was that the universe did not have a beginning and was of infinite age and infinite size. Okay. Then at the beginning of the 20th century, the scientific consensus changed. The universe does have a beginning. It's called the Big Bang, and most likely it will have an end, either with a big crunch or a heat death. And so these are things that cosmologists will discuss. So the scientific consensus changed, and then it changed once again. Because today the view is that, this is increasingly scientific consensus, that the universe, the visible universe is one universe within a larger multiverse. And the multiverse exists, has existed, it's infinite in size, it's infinite in size, I mean, is a metaphorical term in this case because it contains an infinite number of universes. So again, the scientific consensus has shifted at least twice over the past 100 years. And these are mutually exclusive, logically exclusive positions. So it can't be that Islam is conformant and aligns with each one of them. There has to have been a conflict with one of those positions historically. And so this is an example of how Islam and scientific consensus can be in direct conflict. If Muslims in the 19th century had accepted scientific consensus and started interpreting the Quran in order to accommodate this idea of the universe as infinite in size, without a beginning, without an end, they could do that. They could take the specific verses and the hadith about the universe and the creation of the universe, and they could interpret them metaphorically to accommodate scientific consensus. But then at the beginning of the 20th century, through the discoveries of Hubble, that the galaxies were moving past each other or moving away from each other at high speed, therefore that implies that there was a big bang that was at the beginning of the universe. The Muslims would have to then change their position again and reinterpret it again based on this new scientific consensus. And what about now? Now the consensus is increasingly that there's this multiverse. So do we have to go back and read the different ayat and hadith and try to interpret them metaphorically to accommodate this new consensus? I find that a ridiculous proposition. I think that what our posture should be and how we should approach our understanding of divine revelation is that we take it at its word. And there are established means to interpret, do tafsir, exegesis of the Quran that has been established over the centuries in the Islamic tradition. And it's based on understanding the language, the Arabic language. So that based on the Arabic language, you can understand divine speech. You can understand what the Creator has said about His creation. And who better to speak about the creation of the universe and our place in it and what exists and what does not exist than the Creator. So if we take the book of God as Muslims and non-Muslims for what it is and at its word, then that should inform our ontology, how we understand the world, how the world works, and then we can interpret and understand scientific thought in that light. And that's my proposal to you. And in the Q&A, we can discuss that further. So if we've established that Islam and science can conflict, let's go to the more specific question of, does Islam and evolutionary biology conflict? And again, here I want to point out logical conflicts. And there are 2 points of logical conflict that they cannot both be true. So the first is this idea of human abiogenesis, which is the idea that the first human being did not have a biological birth. The first human being did not have a biological birth. That is the traditional Muslim Islamic position, that Adam was the first human being, that he was a special creation, that Allah formed him with His own hands and breathed into him His soul. And so this is what Muslim scholars have taken for granted as being the case for almost 1400 years. Only in the past 150 years have Muslims starting in the colonial period, questioned this narrative. Whereas prior to that, even the rationalists, even the philosophers in the Islamic tradition did not question that Adam was spontaneously generated. And so they're taking this from Aristotelian thought, because Aristotle held that different organisms can be spontaneously generated. And this was the standard classical view, and even Muslim philosophers, rationalists, viewed that as the rational position, that even human beings were spontaneously generated, could be spontaneously generated without a father or mother. So this is human abiogenesis. Human biogenesis is the opposite. The first human beings did have biological births and descended from prior species. And this is an instance of the general principle that all life comes from life. All life comes from life. And this is something that naturalism presupposes, that you can't have spontaneous generation. You can't have life that originates without being descended from biologically through parents or asexual reproduction or whatever it may be, but life can only originate from prior life. So which one of these is correct? They're mutually exclusive. Islam is making a claim, Revelation is making a claim about human origins, and scientific consensus holds a different claim, an exclusive, logically distinct claim. So this is one area of conflict. The other area of conflict is with monogenism. Monogenism is the idea that all of humanity descended from one man and one woman. Okay, this is monogenism. But again, scientific consensus today says otherwise. There's the position that is standard today is polygenism. Polygenism is the view that humanity descended from more than one couple, and the minimum population, the minimum human population at any time was at least 3,000 members of the human population. So again, Islam is saying that all of humanity descended from a couple, Adam and Eve, whereas scientific consensus says that this is not possible, and they have specific arguments for this. So again, very direct, clear-cut conflict. Only one can be right. And so if we want to accept the scientific consensus and say that biogenesis is true, polygenism is true, then we'd have to say something like, well, Adam had parents. Adam had parents. He was born. We'd also have to say that there was no exclusive couple, Adam and Eve. Humanity descended from more than just those two, right? So we'd have to reject the standard, orthodox, traditional view on these issues. And is this cogent? Is this intellectually compelling? Should we as Muslims accept the scientific consensus, reject the traditional understanding in light of that consensus, or do we have to find ways to question and critique the science? That seems to be the hard conflict and the hard choice that we have to make. Could it be that scientific consensus and evolutionary theory, evolutionary biology is mistaken? Is there room for critique? Is there room for questioning this? And to put this, it seems like a stark choice, but I mean, we have to sometimes make stark choices and face these kinds of conflicts. But to put the entire thing in more context, if we look at the history of science, if we look at the philosophy of science, there's much that we can see in how scientific consensus has changed. I already mentioned the different views on whether the universe has a beginning and an end, and the changes over time for that. But there are many other examples of how what was scientifically established, empirically established, and well regarded after some period of time was rejected and fell to the wayside and was thrown in the wastebasket of intellectual history. Simple example, geocentrism versus heliocentrism, right? Ptolemaic model of the cosmos versus a Copernican model of the solar system, right? So going from the view that the Earth is at the center of the universe to the view that the sun is at the center of the cosmos. This was a big revolution, the Copernican revolution. Other examples, the ether theory of space. There was this view that ether permeated all of space. Now that view has been, in the early 20th century, has been discarded and was replaced by electromagnetic field theory. You have Aristotelian dynamics giving way to Newtonian dynamics, giving way to relativistic dynamics in the present time. Newtonian gravitational theory being discarded in favor of relativistic Einsteinian gravitational theory. Phlogiston, the view of combustion, how combustion happens. There's a phlogiston, what's known as phlogiston. You don't really learn that in school, but if you look at the history of science, there's a big revolution in how chemical reactions were understood and how chemicals could interact and create combustion. Whereas prior to this, there was a view of something called phlogiston, which created combustion. Classical dynamics versus quantum mechanics. And as I mentioned, infinite universe without a beginning or an end to the Big Bang theory with a finite beginning and a finite end to the universe. So these are just a sample of the kinds of revolutions that have happened in the history of science. And if you're interested in this topic, I would recommend reading Thomas Kuhn's book, famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he describes many of how these revolutions happened, and they weren't gradual changes, right? It wasn't gradual change over time. Newtonian mechanics, for example, if you're familiar with physics, gradually becoming Einsteinian relativistic mechanics. No, there was Einstein who had certain insights, and he developed his theory of mechanics, and that revolutionized physics, and there was very little relation, there was an incommensurability between Einsteinian relativity and Newtonian mechanics. So this is something that's well recognized in physics. Same thing with gravitational theory, same thing with chemical theory and chemical reactions. You see these paradigm shifts, and this is something that Thomas Kuhn coined. You have a paradigm shift. So my point in bringing these examples is to say that scientific consensus has been wrong in the past. Scientific consensus has been wrong in the past. And this is important to contextualize our situation as Muslims. When we find conflict, seemingly, and not even seemingly, but certain logical conflict between what Revelation says and what scientific consensus says, we should not be depressed by this. We should not be scared of this, okay? We should be confident because history is on our side. History is on our side. And it might not seem like that, especially if you're, doing your PhD in biology or you're a biology student. But there definitely is room for critique and room for analysis to take certain biological evolutionary claims and critique them, specifically when it comes to abiogenesis, as I mentioned, and monogenism. So let's take a closer look at evolutionary theory and see if there is any room for critique. And my view is that you can give philosophical critique, you can also give scientific critique. And I'll touch on both of these avenues of critique in a moment. But if we understand evolutionary biology, there's two major components. One is the idea of genealogical continuity, which is the view that all living things are on the same family tree. Okay? Everything from the amoeba to elephants, to whales and human beings, everything is on the same family tree and have common ancestry. Okay? So this is what I'll call, you can call it common ancestry or genealogical continuity. Okay? Everything is on the same, all life is on the same family tree. This is the what of evolutionary theory. This is the what of evolutionary theory, and it predates Darwin. This is not something that Darwin came up with. This was accepted as the default naturalistic atheistic view. that all life has a common origin. There was no divine intervention. There was no divine creation. All life is on the same family tree. This is the what of evolutionary theory. Then there's the how. If we accept that everything is on the same family tree, it doesn't seem very intuitive. How can a human being and the bacteria on this table or on your hands have a common ancestry? Like, who would think that? How is that possible? And this is where Darwin comes into the picture, and he claims that the mechanism, and this is what he claims in Origin of Species, is that the mechanism that allows or allows common ancestry to exist is natural selection. Okay, natural selection, and I'll explain natural selection in a second. But what I want to emphasize to you is these two components: genealogical continuity, common ancestry, and natural selection. Genealogical continuity is the what, natural selection is the how. How could common ancestry come about? And even well-known atheist Richard Dawkins says in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, he says that prior to Darwin, it was not possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. It's not possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Why? Because you have this belief about the common origin of all species, but it's so preposterous. How could it be? There was no explanation of how this could happen. Okay, so you can't be, as an atheist, comfortable in that. And it seemed at that point that the theists had the upper hand. Those who believed in God had the better explanation, as opposed to the atheists and the naturalists. And so Darwin, it is claimed by Dawkins, Richard Dawkins and others, allowed atheists to be intellectually fulfilled because he gave seemingly a satisfying answer, a satisfying explanation for how common ancestry is possible. And so if we understand that, then this gives us a perspective on how we can critique evolutionary thought and where the weak point is. The weak point is in natural selection. Because if that can be undermined or that can be critiqued, then that brings genealogical continuity back into doubt. It essentially takes the debate on the origin of life back to prior to Darwin, right, in the middle of the 19th century. So that's what I want to emphasize, and the rest of what I'm going to tell you are critiques coming from scientific consensus and current evolutionary biology against natural selection, as well as some philosophical critiques. And what I'm going to explain to you is not is just a small set. There are many critiques, not even by theists, even atheists who have critiqued natural selection and have claimed that Darwinism is incoherent. And even if they don't make that strong of a claim, they say that Darwinism has many problems, has many holes, and there are many different critiques that have been given on Darwinian natural selection. So let's look at the state of evolutionary science. So when we look at the literature coming out today, you find article titles like, does evolutionary theory need a rethink? Does evolutionary theory need a rethink? That was the title of an article in Nature, where they discuss and they debate between two factions, those who are in the Darwinist camp and those who are opposed to Darwinism. Both camps are evolutionary biologists, but increasingly many evolutionary biologists question the relevance or the applicability of natural selection, the adaptationist view. And many claim that Darwinian adaptationism is all but defunct and irrelevant. These include people like James Shapiro of University of Chicago, Dennis Noble, physiologist at Oxford, Evelyn Keller at MIT. These are the kinds of people that are questioning the relevance and the applicability of Darwinism in natural selection. And what even biologists who don't reject Darwinism will say that it has a very small role, if at all, within evolutionary development. And so this is increasingly becoming the consensus that Darwinism is not really relevant to biology. When we look at evolutionary biology and specific species, Darwinistic explanations aren't very compelling. Darwinist explanations aren't very cogent, and they explain why. So one reason why is that one thing that was discovered in the 90s is, and began what's called evolutionary development biology, which is now the dominant school of thought within evolutionary biology, is that if you look across species, such as the fruit fly or squid or even human beings, there's a specific gene that's responsible for large-scale structures within the physiology of an organism. So, for example, the PAX6 gene. PAX6 is responsible for eyes. And so what geneticists realize is that this PAX6 gene is in the fruit fly, it's in squid, it's in human beings, and all kinds of other species that are very distant on, the tree of life. And so how is this? How is there just one single gene responsible? These organisms developed in very different ecological niches, in very different environments. And so how could you have an environment influencing the genetics of an organism when you have very different environments leading to the same PAX6 gene? And so their explanation of this, and this led to the development of what's called evolutionary development biology, is that there are ancient genes. There are ancient genes. PAX6 is one of these ancient genes that belong to an ancient common ancestor. And then as this gene is passed down from generation to generation, different environments trigger how this gene is expressed in the development of the organism. And so that's why a fruit fly's eye is very different structurally in the way that works than a human eye or a squid eye. Even though the gene, that PAX6 gene, is the same, you have completely different physiology. It's completely different phenotype. And so it's the ancient gene that is being expressed differently and being triggered in different ecological niches. This is the standard explanation that's given today. The problem is that this undermines natural selection. Why? Because natural selection says that it is the environment that affects the genotype. It's the environment that affects genes. So now let me explain natural selection. The new synthesis explanation of how species originate is that within a gene, within a genotype, you'll have mutations. The vast majority of these mutations are maladaptive, meaning they hurt the organism. If you mutate certain kind of, if your genes mutate in a certain way, that causes biological problems for you, typically. But in the rare case, you'll have a mutation that is adaptive. It increases your fitness. It increases the organism's ability to reproduce because of the environment. And so, if as a simple example, you have the peppered moth that at a certain point in time had lighter coloration. The wings of the moth were of a lighter coloration in Britain. And then due to pollution, the trees within the environment of the peppered moth became darker and darker in coloration. And what environmentalists notice is that the peppered moth's coloration also began to get darker. So how does this happen? How did the peppered moth's coloration change within just this time span of a decade? And their explanation is that there's a mutation that some of the peppered moths had that made their wings darker in color. And usually that would be a problem, because if the wings of the moth are darker than the trees, then that makes them more visible to predators. And so that's maladaptive because it reduces the chances of reproduction. But if the trees are also getting darker because of pollution through the Industrial Revolution, then that becomes an adaptive trait. And so the environment, in essence, filters that trait. And then the peppered moth with the darker colored wings is able to reproduce more. And then that trait proliferates within the population of peppered moth. Very simple explanation. This is Darwinism. But okay, so think of it abstractly. The environment is what is filtering the different organisms, and that affects the genotype. That affects the genetics within. That affects the gene pool. It affects the genetics of that organism's population. So, but now you have evolutionary development biology, which says, no, you have this ancient gene, and within this ancient gene is the ability epigenetically to adapt in different ecological contexts. But we can ask, well, how did it develop this propensity to adapt in different contexts, in different ecologies? Because that specific ancient common ancestor was only within one ecology, presumably. Okay, if we're imagining like an ancient mouse or an ancient like amoeba, whatever it may be, that's found within a particular ecological context. But the offspring, a million years that trace their lineage down to that common ancestor, are living in very different ecologies. Squid are in the ocean, human beings are on land, certain animals are in the trees of the rainforest. You have very different ecological contexts, but a gene that was developed in one ecological context being able to express itself in a way in all of these different contexts. So that undermines natural selection. And I know that's kind of a complicated argument, but I'm just giving it to you in broad brush. So these are the kinds of issues that we can raise with natural selection. And again, we can ask these ancient genes, how did they develop in such a way to allow for such complex expressions through time? This is an unanswered question. And so the big question, as we said, of the tree of life and common ancestry, that is not addressed. That is not explained anymore. Evolutionary development biology does not explain that in the way that natural selection would. And so this poses a problem, a philosophical and scientific problem for evolutionary biology. The other important scientific consideration is the question of how life originated at all. What is the origin of life? How did the initial building blocks of life, smaller than the cell, okay, such as lipids, proteins, some of the acids that are involved and that are essential components of organic life, how did those develop in the first place? Is this something that could happen purely by chance? And for that, let me read to you the words of a very prominent synthetic chemist named James Tour. And he teaches at Rice University. I recommend you look him up, and you can see some of his videos, and you can also see his paper on this topic. But he's coming from the perspective of synthetic chemistry, meaning that he develops through the laboratory, through advanced means, complex molecules synthetically. Okay, and this man has over 100 patents to his name. He's written over 500 peer-reviewed, published journal articles on synthetic chemistry, and he poses this challenge. He says that I know what it takes to create even the most simple molecules, okay, and it is no trivial task. It is no trivial task. How are you, as an evolutionist or a naturalist, going to tell me that even more complex molecules could have developed ab initio within a goop of matter in a pond somewhere on the earth, a certain number of billions of years ago, through random chance? Is that plausible? Is that feasible? And so he says, no, I know this because I've worked it out. I've worked out the probabilities. I know how difficult it is to create even the simplest molecules, let alone proteins and lipids, nucleic acids, carbohydrates. To think that these more complex molecules, which are still just the basic building blocks of life, could have spontaneously come together through just random chance, the probability involved and the time that would take to happen just through chance is orders of magnitude greater than the lifetime of the known universe. Okay, we're talking about trillions and trillions of years. According to today's consensus, the universe is only between 9 to 15 billion years old. The problem is that most people, even scientists, even students of science, don't really have a good grasp of the difference between a billion and a trillion, let alone a trillion. Okay, it all just seems like big numbers. So if you can just say that, oh, well, just give it enough time, it'll happen. Okay, you can give a hand-waving explanation, and you can say, oh, yeah, of course, just give it enough time, and you can have any kind of complex structure just develop, right? But this is not compelling. This is not mathematical. This is not scientific. And someone like James Tour, again, a synthetic chemist, is in the best position to argue this. So other critiques of natural selection. What time is it? 7:51. Okay, so we have like 10, 15 minutes. So another argument that I think I won't describe it in full, but you should definitely research it if you're interested in this topic, is the classical problem of fitness. The classical problem of fitness. This is the problem of defining fitness in a way that doesn't make natural selection tautological. Okay, and let me describe to you what this is okay, how do we know when an organism is more or less fit? How do we define fitness? Because if fitness is just defined as whatever produces the most organisms, or whatever reproduces another organism, this leads to a tautology, because you're saying that whatever organism proliferates within a population is whatever proliferates within a population. It's circular, it's tautological. And so look up the classical problem of fitness, and you'll see how philosophers of science have tried to get themselves out of this loop by defining fitness in a way that doesn't just reduce to population size, right? How can you tell, and let me put this in simpler terms, how can you tell if you have two, like even the peppered moth, okay, how can you tell that the dark coloration of the peppered moth is more fit than the light colored pepper moth? How can you look at those two and just say, okay, one is more fit than the other? And your response might be, well, of course, the darker peppered moth is more fit, because look at the trees, look at the environment. The trees are darker. It's going to camouflage better. It's going to avoid predators because of that. So clearly it's more fit. But then, okay, think about it from another perspective. Isn't it also the case that it'll be harder to find a mate? Wouldn't bright coloration and sticking out in the environment help it find a mate in order so it can? Wouldn't that confer a reproductive advantage? And we see this in any ecological niche. If you go to the rainforest, you'll see some organisms that are brightly colored, like birds. You'll find some birds that are brightly colored. And the evolutionary explanation of that trait is, well, the coloration helps it find mates. And that's the reproductive advantage. That's why the trait has evolved. But then you'll also have birds that are camouflaging, that are camouflaged. And the explanation for that is, oh, well, that helps them avoid predators. So there's always an explanation. For any given trait, there's always going to be an explanation for why that trait is adaptive. And this is the argument made by, has been made many times in both evolutionary biology and philosophy of biology. One book that I would point you to is What Darwin Got Wrong by Jerry Fodor. And he's a professor, I don't know if he still is, but he was at Rutgers University. He's a philosopher, but he co-wrote that book with a biologist, What Darwin Got Wrong. And he explains this, that that Darwinian natural selection is not really scientific. It's not really scientific. It's post hoc explanation. Post hoc, meaning no matter what trait that you find within a population, no matter what kind of phenotype you have, there's always going to be an evolutionary explanation that you can give after the fact. That's why it's post hoc. It's a just so story, just so, right? You can always, and just so stories, for example, are relevant in history because you can ask questions like, oh, well, why did communism fall, right? Why did communism fall? And you can give all kinds of historical explanations for that. Why did America win the Revolutionary War? Why did the North win the Civil War? You can after the fact, you can always give an explanation, and you can give an explanation that makes it look like it was all but inevitable why this happened, why this historical thing happened. But these are just so explanations. They're historical post hoc explanations. And those kinds of explanations are not scientific. They're not scientific. Because prior to the fact, you cannot predict. You cannot predict what is going to win out. Just like in the case of the peppered moth. You can't, prior to the fact, predict. There's no basis on which to predict, and no one even tries to predict which trait is going to be more adaptive, which trait is conferring the fitness, the dark coloration of the light coloration, or whatever it may be. So this is, I think, one of the deeper critiques of natural selection, and I refer you again to the classical problem of fitness and What Darwin Got Wrong by Jerry Fodor. And what's interesting about Fodor is that he's an atheist. He's not a theist making this argument. He's an atheist who is pointing out that the entire book is dedicated to Darwinism being conceptually incoherent. And I think it's a very powerful book. It caused a lot of controversy, but I definitely recommend that you read it, especially if you're in the sciences or you're interested in philosophy. Another interesting argument that I'll point you to is the argument from Alvin Plantinga, who is a philosopher. He recently won the Templeton Prize. He's very prominent. He's Christian, but he teaches, in secular philosophy departments. And in his book, Warrant and Proper Function, it's a famous philosophy book, he makes a very interesting argument. He asks, how do we know how consciousness evolved? What is the evolutionary explanation for consciousness? And his central insight, the main insight that he gives in this book, is that you can have completely wrong beliefs about the world and still, as an organism, behave in a way that's adaptive. Okay? You can have completely wrong beliefs and still behave in a way that allows you to survive and reproduce and out-reproduce other organisms within your population. How is that the case? So imagine like a Neanderthal, okay? A Neanderthal who believes that, for example, saber-toothed tigers are cuddly and lovable and good pets, like wild saber-toothed tigers. That's his belief, but he also incorrectly believes that the best way to go and hug a saber-toothed tiger is to run the opposite direction as fast as you can, right? Completely incoherent, completely factually false beliefs, but he's still running away from the tiger, right? Or the saber-toothed tiger. So it's the correct adaptive behavior, but that behavior is predicated on wrong beliefs, okay? So this shows how wrong beliefs about the world, factually incorrect beliefs in the world, can proliferate within a population and be adaptive and hence evolve. What this does, though, is it undermines human thought. It undermines our thinking, because how do we know that our understanding of the world as it is not based on falsehoods and is not based on a problematic epistemology or problematic sense perception? What if everything that we perceive in the world is based on faulty perception, right? Our cognition is the product of the development of these false beliefs over time and over the generations. What that would do, it would undermine evolution itself. because evolution is a product of that cognitive evolution. And so Plantinga's argument is that evolution undermines itself. Evolution undermines itself because we have no reason to believe from a purely naturalistic evolutionary perspective that we would evolve a consciousness that correctly represents and understands the world around us. It's far more likely that false beliefs and a false perception of the world around us proliferated and evolved and led to our thought and our beliefs and our perception today, if evolution is correct. So this is, I think, a very powerful argument. It's a very logical argument. It's caused a lot of discussion and debate within philosophy, and specifically the philosophy of biology. So definitely look up Plantinga as well if you want to read more about this. So I've given you a sample of evolutionary or critiques of natural selection. And again, to emphasize, the goal here is that without natural selection, without Darwinism, the idea of common ancestry, the idea of genealogical continuity, the idea of a family tree is undermined because now you don't have an explanation. How are all species related? How are all species from the amoeba to human beings on the same family tree? And so you have this belief that doesn't have an explanation to justify it. And this is interesting, especially if you consider how atheists, and especially new atheists, argue against the existence of God. And they'll say that, why should we believe that God exists? What explanation is there? Without an explanation, why should we, without a reason to believe, why should we accept this? But the same can be said about the thesis of genealogical continuity. Without an explanation, why should anyone, because it's very implausible, just on its face, that the amoeba, bacteria, and human beings, and everything in between are related to a common ancestor. Why isn't the theological explanation of a creator who has created all life, why is that not more compelling? And I think that one of the responses that is made to this, when you argue it from new atheists, atheists generally, is that, you're appealing to God of the gaps. God of the gaps, meaning that whatever science can't explain, we take that as evidence for God. Whatever science cannot explain, then we take that as evidence for God. That's logical fallacy. That's improper reasoning, irrational, according to atheists who say, the God of the gaps argument originated by Christian thinkers, but this is bat that's wielded against theists nowadays, that, you are just, slumming it down to God of the gaps. But I think that we can propose an alternative. There's also a naturalism of the gaps. Whatever science can explain is explained by randomness and long stretches of time. Okay? So science is not able to explain how you can have these complex molecules, proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, form through random processes within the time scale of the known universe, let alone the Earth, the time scale of the Earth's existence. But there's this kind of hand-waving, as I referred to before. If you just give it enough time, random chance, it can be explained. And so there's also this reference to randomness and long stretches of time as an explanation for whatever science currently cannot understand. Same thing with the fine-tuning of the universe. Why is it the case that the universe, all of the physical constants that are relevant to the formation of the solar, like for example, the sun, the solar system, the earth, biological life, such as the gravitational constant, Planck's constant, the speed of light, all of these physical constants that are relevant seem to be perfect or are perfect for the emergence of not only life, but intelligent life. how is that? And I remember in Harvard, one of our physics professors admitted that this is a problem that kept him up at night as an atheist. That how is it that all of these constants are so finely tuned, and it's very strongly evidence of the existence of God, existence of an agent, a creator. And he admitted this in class, but since then, since that time, now what has become in vogue as far as scientific consensus is concerned is this idea of the multiverse. There's an infinite number of universes, and we just happen to be in one that is conducive to life, but the vast majority of universes probabilistically don't have life or intelligent life and are not conducive to life. So this is, I think, a far-fetched explanation, to say the least. And also there's no evidence of these universes. Again, it's this naturalism of the gaps, this appeal to randomness and large stretches of time or large number of entire universes filling this multiverse that no one can ever see or empirically test. That explains to us why the universe that we inhabit has these perfectly tuned constants and physical parameters that allow intelligent life to develop and exist. So I think we have, I just want to make that point because we have arguments to make against atheists and to make against naturalists. And so just to summarize, this is, I think that science and Islam can conflict, sometimes in very direct ways, and we should not be perturbed by that or upset by that or feel like we're on the back foot. In fact, science has gone through a long history of development and change. There have been paradigm shifts. I mentioned several examples. There are many examples of how what was scientific consensus and believed to be empirically and rationally justified at one point in time turned out to be completely false and overturned and replaced with new theories and new models for the physical world. And so if that's the case, we should establish our ontology, our belief about what exists as Muslims, on what God tells us exists and how God tells us the universe was formed and how human beings were formed and human beings have existed at a specific historical time and human civilization and so on and so forth. So this is putting our faith in something that is solid and established in our ontology and our epistemology. What we think, how we learn about the world at large should first and foremost come from revelation. That's the bedrock. This doesn't mean that we have to reject science out of hand or that we're anti-science or anti-rationality. Rather, we have nuanced critiques and we are able to navigate, the talk is navigating faith, scientism, and evolutionary thought. We can navigate these tensions and these conflicts in a way that is rationally compelling and intellectually compelling and consistent with revelation and be authentic to revelation. So my message to you all, especially if you're science students, is to be willing to look past scientific consensus. If you haven't studied the history of science, definitely do so. If you haven't read Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, please do so. Another book that I recommend is, especially to students of science, is Against Method by Paul Feyerabend. Against Method is a very good book because he argues how this notion of the scientific method is actually a myth. Because when we look at the greatest scientific developments of the past 100, 200 years, even 300 years, there is no consistent, essential method that all the scientists involved have followed that we can identify. And so that's why the book is called Against Method, Against the Scientific Method. It's a very compelling argument. So I highly recommend that book. I recommend What Darwin Got Wrong, as I mentioned before, by Jerry Fodor. Another recent book that caused a lot of controversy is Minded Cosmos by Thomas Nagel, another atheist philosopher who says that the evolutionary explanation for the development of life and the development of consciousness is not very compelling at all. In fact, it's very implausible on its face. And so there needs to be a better explanation of how consciousness developed, and how mind has a place within a seemingly materialist, naturalistic world that doesn't accept, supernatural entities or supernatural essences like consciousness and so forth. So Thomas Nagel, Mind and Cosmos. And then also a spiritual message. If you're not a student of science, we need to if we do take our revelation seriously, and we follow the sunnah, the example of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this will raise consciousness of reality around us. Okay, when we read about the angels, the malaika, that surround us, that affects us spiritually and in our hearts, and that affects our behavior, and that is how we develop taqwa and God consciousness. And this is something that's extremely important. We should live in the world as the world described by God, not the dead, naturalistic, material world as described by very, atheistic aspects of science, because that world is not real. The real world is what God describes to us and relays to us and informs us of a reality that, even in principle, in certain aspects, may not be accessible to scientific investigation, empirical investigation. So that ultimately is my message to you. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun al mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for your time. I am going to start with 2 comments and then I have 2 questions.
Okay.
So the first thing is I enjoyed hearing about Darwin, because the just so idea. Because I spent a summer, I read as many books as I could, and one of the books I read was Darwin's Notebooks. And there were so many scattered examples, and if you read it, the logic within it is very scattered itself. It's a little incoherent, so I like having that term. The second thing I liked was the saber-toothed tiger, because I always think about, we have 100 different perceptions of reality. Whether we have a good night's sleep, or if our family yelled at us, or whatever. So I like thinking about Islam as one selection of a perception which brings peace. So that's why I choose this thing. From all the other various perceptions, whether it's substance or whatever. So my question, I have 2. We describe science more as a system of knowledge rather than a process. It wasn't until the end that you talked about the scientific method. So do you think that, if we allow for certain gaps or jumps, could science and Islam be reconciled if science makes further advances that confirm Islam? And then the second question I have is, I think there's 99 names of Allah. One of them is Al-Bari. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I'm not an Arabic speaker. I wish I was. But, so is it possible that Allah is both the creator and the evolver, in the sense that, life is created and he evolves it, and, the descriptions of Adam, the mud is of the earth, and the breath is of the atmosphere, and, things like that. So those were my 2 questions.
All right, the first question was...
could science evolve and confirm Islam in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. I don't think that... it's possible. The example that I give is it might seem scientifically inconceivable or naturalistically inconceivable that a fully developed human being could originate without biological precedents, going back to abiogenesis, life from non-life, or life ab initio. It might seem preposterous from the perspective of current scientific consensus, but just think about the Big Bang, because the Big Bang is cosmologically accepted, and that's the entire universe. That's the entire universe coming from nothing, right? So if we can accept that in principle, why would we, right out of hand reject the possibility of something within the universe being created, which is by definition or logically less complex or less intricate than the entire universe as a whole, just the set versus the subset, mathematically. But and then Allah even says in the Quran, "Antum ashaddu khalqan am as-sama' banaha," right? Antum, are you greater a creation than the sky? Right? Are you a greater creation than the sky? It's speaking to human beings, implying rhetorically that no, you're not. The creation of the heavens is much greater and is much more significant than the creation of human beings. So again, logically, if we accept the idea of a Big Bang in the entirety of the universe, so yes, maybe in the future scientific consensus based on what empirically is found will say that actually, okay, there must have been some kind of spontaneous or within a short period of time human beings originated. I think that is possible. And the second question was, could Allah be the evolver? I mean, that's one translation. I think it's there. I mean, Allah does describe how the stages of development of different things, like the embryo in the Quran, right? So the embryo going from the embryo to the zygote going to the embryo going to the fully developed baby, that's a development, that's process, right? And many other things have been developed in stages. So when it comes to evolution and its implications for Islamic thought, I think again we have to go back to the logical conflicts there. Yes, please.
So, absence our intellect, we are essentially like bipedal, ineffectual apes. But can we sort of think of the advent of the modern human as the advent of intellect, and see humans, anatomically correct humans, as preceding the advent of a human with intellect?
Yeah, so I think what you're referring to is this idea of ensoulment, is that when we read in the Quran about the creation of human beings, what's actually being referred to is ensoulment, that the soul came to a particular ape, and that became Adam, the first human being. And so that's a reconciliation between the Quranic narrative and this idea of and evolutionary biology, which says that you have this gradual change and human species originated from prior species. This is why I set up the talk the way I did. I started with abiogenesis, right? The idea that Adam was not born, does not have a father and mother. So that can't be reconciled with the interpretation that you gave. And it's still problematic from a naturalistic perspective to say that human consciousness originated from nothing, like divine intervention breathed the soul, breathed consciousness into the human being, and that's where human beings originated from. That's also problematic from a naturalistic perspective, because again, it's still a spontaneous generation of consciousness, and consciousness is something. The mind is something that science discusses and tries to understand historically. So Muslims who try to reconcile with this kind of ensoulment view that the chain of evolution, the evolution of humans, is exactly as biology describes, evolutionary biology describes, and it's just the soul that has been inserted at a specific point, that doesn't really solve any problem. There's still conflict for the reasons that I described. Do sisters have any questions? If you don't want to ask a question out loud, you can also write it and pass it to the front. So, no questions yet. Okay, yes.
I'm curious, to what extent is flashing theoretical conclusions. Sorry, what I mean is to clarify. I think it's like is there something to be said also for the way that the overstatement of certainty within a scientist's worldview and culture that's different from an Islamic epistemic, or the way that we approach knowledge in Islam. I think there's something to be said also about the very confident declaration of scientism in its species that's like endemic to scientism itself. And so I was wondering if you could speak to sort of like, how do we position, is there a different way that we should position ourselves towards knowledge in the world, or about the material world?
Yeah, is there a better way to position ourselves as Muslims vis-a-vis knowledge of the world, as opposed to a scientific approach? Yeah, I definitely agree. I think there is a culture problem. I mean, we can have a whole talk about the culture. But scientific conclusions are, especially when it comes to evolutionary biology, because there's a lot of ideology that's at stake when it comes to evolution. So conclusions are often overstated. And things are presented within popular science as being beyond question, when in fact, within the scientific discourse itself, if you go back and you read the papers, the actual scientific papers within the journals, there's plenty of questions. There's plenty of uncertainty, but that doesn't get filtered into the public discourse. And so I did a lot of research on the claim that human beings and chimpanzees share 99% of the same genome. And this is an argument often used in these discussions to say that, well, how could you possibly deny that human beings and chimpanzees share a common ancestor when 99% of the genome overlaps and matches? So this is a rhetorical argument. Nowadays, you won't hear any serious person who's scientifically literate make this claim because of developments of just the past 7 years, and I'll explain to you in a second. But prior to 2010, this was a very big talking point. So I wanted to investigate this, and at first I thought, oh, how am I going to argue this? Because this is what science says. It's definitely the case that we share 99% of the genome. So I started doing research. I started reading these actual papers. And I was shocked. I was shocked to see the amount of uncertainty and how tenuous the actual claim of 99% is. Because the original claim of 99% is not even based on the entirety of the genome. All of the claims of genetic similarity between human beings and chimpanzees, or human beings and cats, or dogs, or mice, are based only on protein coding elements of the genome. The part of the genome that is responsible for coding proteins that are involved in all biological processes, physiological processes. So you're only looking at 2% of the genome, and within that 2%, you're saying that 99% or 95% or 97%, depending on the paper that you're reading, is similar. What about the 98% of the rest of the genome? You're not even factoring that into the similarity consideration. And there's plenty more details on this. I wrote an entire paper with my findings. I read over 50 separate scientific papers. But then another thing that was discovered very recently, 2010, is that what previously was considered the dark regions of the genome, which was considered junk DNA. Junk DNA is the term that was used prior to 2010. They've discovered that, no, actually this, and that's the 98%, is actually very important. It's very important to the development of an organism. Who would have thought it? Who would have thought that 90% of the genome is actually doing something, is actually contributing to the development of that organism? So this shows the arrogance, right? Oh, we don't understand these specific regions consisting of transposable elements and all this other part of the genome. So let's just say it's junk. Because we don't understand it, therefore it must be junk. This is the arrogance. And then to portray your conclusions in such ironclad language. And yeah, so nowadays no serious person said, and even like one of the main scientists, one of the main geneticists involved with the Human Genome Project, which was the first to compare a complete human genome with the draft genome of chimpanzee draft genome, Svante Pabo. I don't know if I pronounced his name correctly, but he says that it's meaningless. Now he admits it's meaningless to compare human and chimp DNA. It's meaningless. It's just a cultural kind of, or philosophical, ideological kind of comparison to make. But really, there's no way to compare because they're so divergent. Like, yeah. So it's I won't bore you with all the details, but I have a paper that you can read if you just search my last name, or you can find it on my website, muslimskeptic.com, if you're interested in that. But I agree with you. There's so much overstatement within scientific culture, and behind closed doors, scientists admit that, oh, we don't really have the answers. But because it's so ideological, there's a different public perception. Okay, please.
I have
Yeah,
quick
sure.
suggestion. Can we like have the formal Q&A and like soon in 5-10 minutes, and then maybe because some people may want to leave and like they want to strip topic, like they can leave, and if you have a question, you can like ask one-on-one, like in a smaller group, in a smaller interaction group. Is that all right?
Okay, yeah. Whoever wants to leave can leave at any time. Don't feel like you have to stay. Do you think? Or is the room gonna be closed?
Probably like
Yeah. Yes, please.
Welcome. I was saddened that your talk at the Tufts was cancelled. I'm glad you came here, and I'm also saddened by the email you got from the MIT.
You're saddened by it?
I am saddened.
Oh, okay.
To see that email. Having said that, I want to make a criticism to your
Sure.
talk. So you rightfully put the scientific thought like open to criticism, changing, which is true. So scientists are trying to read the book of universe, if you can say that, and they are making some interpretations, and it's evolving over time. And but it seems like you, in the religious sphere, we are also reading the book of God, right? They are reading the book of universe, we are reading the book of God, and we are going through a similar process, like interpretation change. And it's also obvious from the methods, right? The methods all have, different opinions on certain topics. That also shows that interpretation plays a big role. So, what's your opinion on that? Like, how can you claim that you seem to, I don't know if I misunderstand you, but you seem to favor the opinion that religious understanding is more fixed and more authoritative, which, if you think more about it, it's also a human process, right? So you read the book, you got something, and I read it, I can see evolution in the book. There are some people who wrote about it and so on. So why are you freezing, I'm exaggerating a little bit, freezing the religious interpretation while attacking the scientific interpretation?
Well, so the question is, why am I freezing, or why do I put precedence or priority within the traditional classical interpretations? I mean, that's one way to look at it. The way that I prefer to look at it is by the numbers. What percentage of Muslim scholars historically thought one way versus another way? And so, yes, you do have differences among the madhab, the schools of thought, in fiqh, in theology, in all the Islamic sciences. You have differences of opinion, no doubt about it. Nonetheless, there are areas of consensus as well. And there are areas where no one There was not a single divergent opinion until, you know, the modern period, colonialism, and Islam's confrontation with European thought. So when I see that, it's a very logical thought process. If 99% or 99.9% of scholars thought one way, there must be a good reason for it. If I find someone that is of the caliber of those past scholars who has a contrary opinion, the 0.01% that contradicts the 99.9%, okay, then we can evaluate that. But purely from a probabilistic perspective, knowing nothing else, what's more rational? I think it's clear what's more rational. You accept the majority opinion. 99.9% might even be understating it. But if you do, so Islamically, we also have this understanding that the most learned generations of Muslims were the earlier generations. The companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, understood revelation far better than we do, or we can. First of all, we're not with the Prophet, peace be upon him. We're not in his companionship. There's no suhbah with him. And so much of knowledge that they gained was not even propositional knowledge, meaning knowledge through statements. Because the sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him, is not only his statements, it's also his actions, his mannerisms, what he approved of. So they had access to that because they're seeing him with their own eyes. We cannot see him. We cannot be his companions. We only have written propositional statements that we can read and then try to understand. So because of that, we're handicapped severely. So this is why, the Sahaba, the Tabi'een, the Taba Tabi'een, their knowledge was far superior. The context that they're living in also is more conformant. So the structure of society affects how you understand revelation. The dominant paradigms of thought that you have and have internalized by virtue of living in this particular era will affect how you read the Quran and understand the Quran and read Hadith and understand Hadith. That's one. Your language. Most of us don't have very high levels of classical Arabic language. So all of these factors contribute to weaknesses and defects in how a modern person, even the most knowledgeable of today, pales in comparison on 50 separate points that I could list for you compared to someone just 300 years ago, a scholar of 300 years ago, let alone 1,000 years ago. This is a fact, and it's acknowledged by even the greatest scholars of today that their knowledge compared to their predecessors, the ulama of the past, it's like comparing a kindergartner with a advanced professor, tenured professor at Harvard or MIT. This is something that is acknowledged. So rationally, who's interpreted, especially on things that are consensus, ijma', right? Not even talking about daruri, things that are known by necessity of the religion, ma'lum min ad-din bid-durura. Not even that, even ijma' issues, it's not rational as far as I can tell to just prefer any kind of modern view that diverges with what has been established through consensus.
Are you claiming that there is consensus on evolution being wrong?
On as I mentioned, those logical points that I made, abiogenesis and monogenism, that Adam a.s. did not have mother, father, and that all of humanity descends from a couple, those are consensus, yes. Even the rationalists of our tradition, the philosophers, did not dispute this.
If I just may continue.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if someone else. Yeah, we can come back.
Well, I'd really like to continue along Haqiqatjou's line of thought, actually. So one of the questions I have is that if apes and humans have such little genetic overlap, how come God was able to evolve apes from people in the Quran? I mean, if that's something that you believe, right? You remember what I'm talking
Yeah.
about. So what's the viewpoint on this?
Well, God just says, "Kun fayakun," just be and it is. So it's not really a.
So then, by the same argument, why are you computing probabilities about the world that's around you? God said that it was this way, and so it is.
Yeah, I mean that whole argument, fine tuning, is an argument that you make to someone that does not believe in God, right?
I'm a bit confused, actually, a little bit more
Sure.
basically, right? Your belief in God is conflicted, as I understand it. Like, in other words, if in some future hypothetical circumstance you became convinced that Darwin was right, that we did have to.
I personally was convinced.
Yeah. That
Anything's possible.
Well, I mean, I don't know, right?
Yeah.
But this would mean that you would leave Islam, right? This conflicts so deeply with the Quran, your understanding of the Quran, that you would leave.
I mean that's a question in bad faith. Like, I think if you didn't believe in God, would you? If you came to the conclusion that God didn't exist, would you believe in God? Like, you can propose anything.
Let me make it another way. So it's do you accept that God uses figurative language in the Quran?
Yeah, and it's very clear from the language where it's figurative and where it's
I don't think it's clear.
based on what. Why is it not clear?
Based on the reading of the Quran. Like, can you label? Like, it's not like they're highlighted, right? There's not a footnote that says this is literal and this is figurative, right?
If you know the language, if I tell you to go feed the meter right now, are you going to go like try to give it a hamburger? Or do you understand, based on your understanding of the English language, that I'm speaking allegorically or metaphorically?
So I'm an Arab, right? I'm an
Okay.
Arabic speaker. Like Haqiqatjou is saying, what you're arguing about is whether or not this book, which was divinely written, would have been, like, another way to put this is, am I part of the audience of this book or no? Right? If I'm part of the audience of this book, then you must accept that my view of the world, all the things that I experience, the lens of all of that is part of the lens that God knew someone would be reading the Quran with thousands of years ago.
No, God doesn't say that
In other
the
words,
Quran can be just understood by anyone according to their knowledge of the language or not. No.
that's kind of what you're getting at, right? So another way to put that, once again, is that God didn't underline for any Arabic speaker to understand this is a literal sentence or this is a figurative sentence
No.
for a particular ayah.
Yeah, but those who know the language at that level that's required of classical Arabic know that that's the case. Let me give you an analogy. Let me give you.
I'm sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
How do you know when you reach that level?
People have reached out. It's something that's objective, right? So, for example, I can bring. Let me give you an analogy. I can bring a physics.
Sorry, I don't need another analogy. I'm asking. Really, I'm
Are you
serious.
asking?
If
I don't see what you're. I'm trying to address your point, right?
Like, see the step that I'm taking. What if I told you that I felt that I could reach that level?
Based on what? Can I tell you that I'm going to teach physics at MIT tomorrow?
You kind of are, right? I mean, you're not a
No, I haven't
biologist,
claimed that I can teach physics at MIT.
But you actually are at MIT talking about biology,
Yeah,
right?
something that I've studied and something that I've researched.
Okay.
And so if you have a problem with something that I've said in the biological terms, please raise that objection. I mean, that's what this Q&A
But I actually-
session is about.
The thing is, I don't want to get lost in a particular detail, right? I'm not actually.
Devil's in the details, my friend.
Well,
right.
It kind of is, right? Because it's
So raise those details.
brother, the substance of what you're saying
Mhm.
is, and I'm really just trying to understand the angst that you have between the popular, right, the current mode in scientific thought, right, which is, we all admit it's the current mode, right? I don't think there's a scientist in the world who is so arrogant to believe that it won't evolve, that the viewpoint won't evolve with one data, right?
Well, naturalists don't anticipate that
I don't
their theories will lead to a belief in God.
I think it's worth talking to like a professor or something here to see, because in my experience,
Have I, or you don't think I have?
I'm sorry, they're quite humble people usually, and they're not they're not so stubborn that they won't accept that their viewpoints will change with more data. But the point that I'm making is that there's a meta argument that's being made, and I want to address that more directly, which is that, if there is a conflict between scientific viewpoint and your readings of the Quran, that's a cause for angst. You understand?
I didn't say it's a cause for angst.
Then why are you giving this talk? Like, in other words,
There's a logical conflict, right?
No, that's the part that I'm a bit more concerned about. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, so how is there not a logical conflict? Because your reading, you think it's all metaphor. You think it's all allegorical.
I think it's possible that it is all metaphor.
Okay, yeah. So just like you can bring a science textbook here, okay, a physics textbook, and say, yeah, I think this is all this book of evolution, origin of species. It's all metaphorical. Like Darwin was just speaking in flowery language. This is all like there's no reality. This is poetry. This is fiction that he wrote.
Brother,
That's what I think.
No one worships Darwin. I've never met a single person that does. And no one thinks that they can't tell the difference between literal and figurative speech. You're talking about the divine text, right?
Yeah. So point to me someone outside of the modern colonial period, after European scientific thought was spread through the Muslim world by force. Point to me someone outside of that scholar who interpreted it metaphorically. I just said that it doesn't exist. So if I'm wrong about that, please bring someone and point to
So you're saying that
the
every
text.
scholar, right, like in history, has regarded the book as literal, ayah by ayah?
The book as literal?
Yeah, the Quran.
No, that's not the claim. The specific claims about Adam and Eve, no one interpreted that as metaphorical. Even the hardcore rationalists and philosophers, they did not interpret it as metaphorical.
Maybe we should
Okay.
a lot of other people questions.
Yeah, let's move on. Sisters? Okay, let's go to the protester.
Sure. Yeah, and I'll start by saying I'm glad that your talk was canceled at Tufts, and I'm very proud of the MIT alumni because I think you have very dangerous views and sexist views and what have you. But I think in this talk, first of all, I think it's very reductive, and I think what the gentleman in the back is saying is basically an apologetic to have this talk in the first place. But
Can you speak a little bit louder? I can't hear you.
sure, I'm saying that I think this will be. What's that? Sure. Okay. My question is, if you're going to talk about Islam, science, and scientific consensus, can you define those terms?
What, science and scientism?
No, science, Islam, and scientific consensus. You use them very loosely.
Yeah.
First of all, Islam is very, very far from this monolithic entity that you explained, and you could argue that science and Islam are not separate entities. They're not.
Science and Islam are not separate entities?
Yeah. Where do you get off the idea that Islam and science are separate is a very Western conception that is a post-Enlightenment conception of what it means to be a religion. That is the secular versus the unsecular idea. So I think you really need to rethink that categorization of Islam versus science, which is, I think.
Okay, I don't understand how science and Islam are the same thing.
I'm not saying they're the same thing. I'm saying that your categorization of them as two different things, as you're like kind of pitting them against each other, ignores the fact that they have overlap. So you're dealing
I didn't deny that they have overlaps. I pointed to very specific conflicts, right? Abiogenesis, monogenism. Those are the only two conflicts that I mentioned. They're logically conflicting.
Okay, but that does not mean that the way that you approached science as a category and Islam as a category without defining them in any sense it's irresponsible.
If I want to define Islam for you, yeah, I can define Islam for you. Can you
What?
define any? Islam is the religion of God.
What is
It is
it?
revealed to the
What is
Prophet.
it? Who is God? What is God?
Yeah, if you want to talk about atheism, who is God, like we have to have a much bigger conversation because we're not. Our point of departure is so far apart. Like you're questioning what God, who God is.
Yeah,
So no definition that I give you is acceptable, right? You can question any kind of definition that proposed. So maybe we should just talk of what?
What's the definition? I don't know. We should define.
Yeah, what is a definition?
Sure, but you can't talk about Islam as just this like entity, which is what you're
I
doing.
just did. This whole talk, I just did talk about Islam as an entity. I pointed to very specific claims, and I asked, I think a very fair question is that if you find someone from any historical period other than the past 150 years post-Darwin who makes a claim otherwise, please bring it forward.
And then what will happen?
Then we can address it.
We can?
Yes.
And I mean, seriously though, like you're going to withdraw and become a scientist?
No, that's just one interpretation. Like, if it's like this is just an abstract possibility because
It's a hypothetical challenge. Like you're telling me, hey.
no, it's not hypothetical. I know that there is no one who has had this opinion. I haven't been able to find it. Others who have searched for it haven't been able to find it. If you find someone, please bring it forward. It's very simple. Wait, what?
What if the writings were burned when the Mongols invaded Baghdad or something?
If it was influential enough to be taught, okay, then we should be able to find.
I'm sorry. The writing was lost to water.
If you're talking hypotheticals, we can literally go on for one thing. Because then hypothetical after hypothetical after hypothetical is addressed.
Okay, another question? Yes, please.
So we're discussing navigating phase. So looking at scientists generally use models with the understanding that models can be wrong, totally wrong, can be refined
Right.
better. So looking at Darwinism as a model, how could it be in conflict with theology?
How could Darwinism be in conflict with theology?
Looking at Darwinism as a model,
Yeah.
how could that be in conflict with theology?
I spelled out the conflict, right?
No, I understand, but I'm just saying, just looking at a model, a conception in your mind, with the understanding that it could be totally wrong. But you're
So
using
as Muslims, we can evaluate things outside of a purely theological perspective as well. We can analyze and critique a system of thought based on its coherence. We can argue based on its rationality. There are all kinds of avenues available to a Muslim, a thinking Muslim, to critique any given claim. So Darwinism, I've pointed to critiques from atheists, from Christians, from philosophers, on why Darwinism has these inconsistencies and problems. I refer you to those books again. As far as theology is concerned, I kept it very specific on purpose, okay? Because I've had this conversation with Muslims over the past 10 years. And I know all of the counter arguments that are made and all the typical things that are said. So I made it very explicit exactly where the conflict lies, okay, in those specific points, because those are things that you can't really fudge. You can't really, you can claim that it's metaphorical, the entire narrative of Adam and Eve, but then you run up into problems in language, understanding language. You have to kind of resort to this relativistic or postmodernist view that, anyone's interpretation is fine, right? So the conflict is right there within those 2 points. And then outside of that, you can imply any kind of critique to Darwinism as a model as a whole.
Daniel, is majority opinion a way in Islam to arrive at truth? I think it's mostly criticized in Quran that says if you obey the majority of people, they would lead you astray. Right? There's a verse.
Yeah.
Before you answer it, just quickly, because it's like 8:50. Like,
Yeah.
let's make this the last question. Like, just come here, ask questions.
I think
Just
this
answer.
is why are you trying to so much?
All right. You've already asked some questions, so you can wait until afterwards, and then we can talk. Does anyone else have a question? I thought someone.
I wanted to mention the point that it seems like a lot of the disagreement here is about like furor, I suppose you would say, or being like the rather than the fundamentals of the worldviews. And I think it might be easier to understand what the conflict is if we. I'm just beginning 20 minutes of your talk, so I apologize if you did cover this at the beginning. But perhaps if you understood it that way, scientism is ultimately a materialist philosophy, whereas Islam is not, and that's basically where many of these disagreements about evolution. Evolution is it's not an axiomatic problem. It's sort of it's a different it's like a conclusion that's a result of a logical thought process. And if we're not agreeing on the basis of our axioms, so where we're reasoning from, then yes, we have different conclusions. Even if, for example, everybody in this room agreed about evolution, it still would not be a good idea. There would still be potential conflicts between scientism and Islam because fundamentally scientism is a materialist philosophy and Islam is not. And like, for example, angels or jinns or all these things that are not experimentally testable or verifiable. Anybody who adheres to scientism as a philosophy will end up with philosophical issues, theological issues, and maybe that would add some perspective to this.
Yeah, there's so much that conflicts with the materialistic or naturalistic worldview. The beginning of the talk, I listed a bunch of these conflicts. The createdness of the universe itself, the existence of angels and their effect on the world, existence of jinn and their effect on the world, the concept of baraka, the concept of sihr, the evil eye. These are things that are described within Revelation and the statements of the Prophet, peace be upon him. His behavior and his actions is very clearly documented. And the actions and behavior of the Sahaba, they took these literally as realities, but things that affect the world in tangible and perceptible ways. But these are things that are not acknowledged or accepted by a materialist, naturalistic worldview. So, we didn't get into how to reconcile this or how to approach it. I just cited those as examples of the kind of conflict or the depth of conflict, the profundity of conflict between naturalism and an Islamic worldview and ontology. Okay, jazakallah khair.